James Cartwright stood at the edge of the rocky outcrop, watching the Pacific Ocean churn beneath a steel-grey November sky. At 47 years old, his weathered face carried lines that spoke of too many years on the water and too many nights without sleep. 4 years ago, he had retired from the Coast Guard after 23 years of service. Not retired exactly. He had walked away in the middle of the night with his resignation letter on his commander's desk because he could not bear to put on that uniform one more day, not after what happened to his son. The Oregon coast near Cape Perpetua was brutal and beautiful in equal measure. Jagged black rocks rose from churning surf, creating tide pools that teemed with life during low tide and became death traps when the ocean reclaimed them. James had moved here 3 months after the funeral. His ex-wife Sarah had stayed in their house in Portland, surrounded by memories and photographs. James had chosen isolation. He had chosen this small cabin perched above the coast, where the only sounds were wind and waves and the occasional cry of seagulls. He came to this particular outcrop most mornings. It was a 15-minute hike from his cabin down a steep trail that wound through Sitka spruce and shore pine. The trees grew stunted and twisted here, shaped by constant wind into forms that looked like they were fleeing inland. James understood that feeling, the permanent lean away from the source of pain. On this particular morning in early November, the ocean was angry. A storm had passed through during the night, leaving behind confused seas and a bitter wind that cut through his heavy jacket. The tide was going out fast, pulled by forces that cared nothing for human concerns or schedules. James watched the water recede from the rocks, revealing barnacles and mussels clinging to stone. Survival in the intertidal zone required holding on when everything tried to tear you away. He was about to turn back toward the trail when he saw something in the water. At first he thought it was a seal, but the movement was wrong. Too purposeful, too desperate. James moved closer to the edge, squinting against the glare of filtered sunlight breaking through clouds. There, about 40 yards offshore, a dark shape surfacing and diving. His Coast Guard training kicked in before his conscious mind could catch up. That was not normal behavior. That was distress. James scrambled down the rocks, moving with the sure-footedness that came from years of working on pitching decks in rough seas. He reached a lower shelf of rock where spray from waves soaked his boots and jeans. The shape surfaced again, closer now, and James felt his breath catch in his throat. It was an orca calf, maybe a year old, no more than 12 feet long. Its distinctive white eye patch was clearly visible even at this distance. But something was terribly wrong. The calf's movements were jerky, uncoordinated. It surfaced gasping, then dove again, but the dive was shallow, barely submerging. And there was blood. James could see it now, staining the water around the calf in spreading ribbons of dark red that dissipated in the current. A lot of blood. The calf surfaced again, and this time James saw the wound. The animal's right flank was torn open, a ragged gash at least 4 feet long, running from just behind the dorsal fin down toward the tail. The edges of the wound were white and pulpy, exposed blubber gleaming wetly in the grey light. More blood pulsed from the injury with each beat of the calf's heart. Propeller strike. James recognized it immediately. Some boat, probably a commercial fishing vessel or maybe even a pleasure craft, had hit this young orca. Depending on how deep the wound went, the calf might have hours or minutes. But here was the thing that made James freeze completely. The calf was not swimming away. It was swimming toward him. The young orca surfaced 15 yards from where James stood. Its eye, the size of a grapefruit, fixed on James's face, with an intensity that seemed impossible for an animal that was clearly dying. The calf vocalized a sound James had never heard before in person, though he had listened to recordings of orca calls during his Coast Guard training. It was not the typical underwater clicks and whistles. This was something else. A sound that came from the surface, a desperate whistling cry that carried across the water. James stood motionless. Orcas were not typically dangerous to humans. There were no recorded attacks by wild orcas on people ever. But this was a wounded animal, and wounded animals were unpredictable. Still, the calf made no aggressive moves. It simply held position in the water, watching James with that eye that seemed to hold far too much awareness, far too much intelligence. Then the calf did something that changed everything. It swam closer, moving through the swells with obvious pain until it was less than 10 yards away. Close enough that James could see the wound clearly now, could see that it was not just a surface injury. The propeller had cut deep through blubber, possibly into muscle. Without medical attention, this animal would bleed out or die of infection within days, possibly hours. The calf turned slowly, presenting its wounded flank to James. The movement was deliberate, unmistakable. The orca was showing him the injury, asking for help. James felt something crack open inside his chest. Some wall he had built carefully over 4 years threatened to crumble. He had not saved anyone in 4 years. He had not tried to save anyone in 4 years. After his son Ethan drowned during that storm when James was 100 miles away, responding to another emergency, James had promised himself he would never again put himself in a position where someone's life depended on his actions. Never again would he have to live with the knowledge that he had failed when it mattered most. But this young orca was asking him, choosing him. The way Ethan used to look at him when he was little, with absolute faith that Dad could fix anything, that Dad would always be there when it counted. The calf vocalized again that same desperate cry. Then it did something even more remarkable. It started swimming parallel to the shore, moving south at a slow, careful pace. It swam maybe 20 yards, then stopped and looked back at James. The message could not have been clearer. "Follow me." James scrambled back up the rocks, his heart hammering against his ribs. His mind was already racing through possibilities. He had basic medical training from the Coast Guard, but nothing that would prepare him for treating a wounded orca. He had supplies at his cabin, antiseptic bandages, suture kits, but would any of that even work on a creature this size in the water? He needed to make a decision. The rational part of his brain was screaming that this was insane. You could not treat a wild orca. Even if he somehow managed to get close enough to the wound without getting hurt, the animal was probably too far gone anyway. The kindest thing would be to call the Marine Mammal Stranding Network and let trained professionals handle it. Let them make the call about whether the calf could be saved. But something deeper than rationality was pulling at James. This animal had chosen him, had sought him out specifically, and was asking him to follow. And despite every wall he had built, despite every promise he had made to himself, James found his feet moving. He ran back up the trail to his cabin. His lungs burned with exertion, and the cold air tasted of salt and rain. He burst through his cabin door and started grabbing supplies. A backpack waterproof, his old Coast Guard medical kit that he had kept all these years. Extra gauze, rolls of bandages, antiseptic solution. A wetsuit, because if he was going to do this, he would need to get in the water. Rope. A tarp. His handheld marine radio. He changed into the wetsuit in record time, pulling it on over his still damp clothes. His hands were shaking, from cold or fear or something else he could not name. He grabbed his binoculars and ran back out to the trail. The calf was still there, waiting just offshore. When James appeared on the outcrop, the young orca surfaced and vocalized again. Then it continued swimming south parallel to the coast. James followed, running along the rocky shore, scrambling over tide pools and kelp-covered stones. The calf kept pace with him about 30 yards offshore, moving slowly enough that James could follow, but never stopping, never turning back toward open ocean. The animal was bleeding continuously now, leaving a visible trail in the water that sharks would be able to sense from miles away. They traveled south for maybe half a mile. James's lungs were burning and his legs were screaming, but he did not slow down. The coastline here was a series of rocky points, separated by small coves. Most of the coves emptied completely at low tide, exposing sandy bottoms and tide pools. But one particular cove about a quarter-mile ahead was different. James knew it well. It was deeper than the others, protected on 3 sides by high rock walls. At high tide, it filled completely, becoming a sheltered pool. At low tide, like now, it still held water maybe 4 or 5 feet deep at the center. The calf was leading him to that cove. As James rounded the final point and looked down into the protected inlet, his heart stopped. There, in the center of the cove, in water that was already getting dangerously shallow, was an adult orca. A big adult, probably 25 feet long. The mother. She was trapped. James could see it all clearly now. The mother orca had brought her wounded calf into this sheltered cove, probably to protect the young one from sharks that would be attracted by the blood. But she had misjudged the timing of the tide. The entrance to the cove was narrow, barely wide enough for her massive body to fit through. At high tide, that entrance would be filled with 10 or 12 feet of water. But the tide was going out fast, and James could see the opening was now less than 4 feet deep in places. Rocky outcrops that had been submerged when the orcas entered were now exposed, creating a barrier. The mother was pacing in the shallow water, her massive dorsal fin cutting through the surface. She could not turn around in this confined space, could not build up enough speed to jump the barrier. And if she tried to force her way through that narrow rocky opening at this depth, she would tear herself apart on the stones. The calf surfaced in the cove next to its mother. The two orcas touched, their communication invisible but clearly intense. The mother was vocalizing now too, her calls deeper, more powerful than her calf's, but carrying the same desperate quality. James stood at the edge of the rocks, looking down at the two trapped orcas, and felt the full weight of the situation crash over him. The tide was going out. In maybe 2 hours, the cove would be almost completely dry, just a few feet of water at the very center. These orcas had maybe 3 hours before they were beached and helpless. 4 hours maximum before their own weight crushed their internal organs, or they overheated in the sun, or they simply suffocated, unable to breathe properly out of the water. And the calf had brought him here, had swum more than half a mile, bleeding and dying, to find the one human on this empty stretch of coast. To lead James to his mother. The calf had watched James every morning for how long? Days, weeks, studying this solitary human who came to the rocks at dawn, making the same kind of assessment that James made about whether someone could be trusted, whether someone would help. James pulled out his marine radio and switched to channel 16, the emergency frequency. His hand hovered over the transmit button. If he called this in, the marine mammal stranding network would respond. They had equipment, veterinarians, experience with this kind of situation, but they were probably hours away. The nearest team was likely in Newport, at least 90 minutes south, and that was if they dropped everything immediately. By the time they arrived, the tide would be critically low. The orcas might already be beached. There was another option. James could try to help them himself. He had maybe 3 hours to keep these animals alive until high tide came back. 3 hours to treat the calf's wound, to keep them both calm, to somehow ensure they did not panic and hurt themselves trying to escape the shrinking pool. It was insane, reckless, dangerous, everything that went against his training, that went against the promises he had made to himself. But the calf was looking at him again with that impossibly intelligent eye, and James saw his son in that gaze. Saw Ethan at 15 years old looking back from the deck of their sailboat the summer before he died. Saw the absolute trust that James would make the right call, that Dad always knew what to do. James had failed that trust once, had been 100 miles away when Ethan needed him most, had arrived too late, done everything right by the book, called in the helicopters, coordinated the search, had found his son's body 3 days later, washed up on a rocky beach not unlike this one. He could not fail again. James clipped the radio to his belt without making the call. He took a deep breath of the cold salt air and started climbing down into the cove. The descent was treacherous. The rocks were covered in seaweed and barnacles slick with spray. James moved carefully, testing each handhold, each foothold. His wetsuit was already soaked through from spray and his hands were numb, but he kept moving. He reached the edge of the water and paused. Both orcas were watching him now. The mother had moved to position herself between James and her calf, her massive body a wall of black and white muscle. Her eye tracked his every movement. James could see the tension in her body, the way her pectoral fins were held tight against her sides, ready to strike if this human proved to be a threat. James spoke softly, not because he thought the orca would understand words, but because tone mattered. Every animal understood tone. "I'm here to help. Your son brought me here. I'm going to try to help both of you." He slowly lowered himself into the water. It was shockingly cold, even through the wetsuit. The cove was maybe 40 feet across and roughly circular. The depth at this point was probably 5 feet at the center, but getting shallower by the minute. James could feel the pull of the outgoing tide tugging at his legs. The mother orca turned to face him fully. She was enormous up close, a creature built for the deep ocean compressed into this tiny shallow pool. She could kill him with one strike of her tail, could bite him in half with jaws that were designed to grip and tear. But she did not attack. She watched. James moved slowly through the water, keeping his hands visible, moving in what he hoped was a non-threatening way. He angled toward the calf, which had positioned itself near the far wall of the cove. The wound on the young orca's flank was still bleeding, though possibly slower now, hard to tell with all the water. He pulled his waterproof medical kit from his backpack. The absurdity of what he was about to attempt hit him fully. He was going to try to treat a wounded wild orca with supplies meant for humans while standing chest-deep in freezing ocean water, while the animal's mother watched from 10 feet away, ready to defend her baby with lethal force. The calf watched James approach. It made a sound somewhere between a whistle and a chirp. The mother responded with her own vocalization. Some kind of communication was happening, James was certain. The mother was probably telling her calf to stay away from the human. And the calf was probably saying, "But this is the one I chose, the one who will help." James stopped about 6 feet from the calf. He opened his medical kit and pulled out a large bottle of saline solution and a handful of gauze pads. He held them up where both orcas could see. "I need to clean this wound," he said quietly. "It's going to sting, but it has to be done." He took one more step closer. The calf did not move away, did not thrash or vocalize in fear. The young orca simply watched James with that impossibly aware eye. James extended his hand slowly and touched the orca's skin for the first time. The texture surprised him, not smooth like he had expected, but slightly rough like wet rubber. Warm, too warmer than the surrounding water. He could feel the powerful muscles beneath the skin, could feel the animal's heartbeat rapid and strong. The calf flinched at the contact, but did not pull away. James began gently cleaning around the edges of the wound, rinsing away blood and debris. The injury was worse up close than he had thought. The propeller had not just cut the skin and blubber, it had damaged the underlying muscle. James could see the white of connective tissue, the pink of exposed muscle fiber. This wound needed stitches, needed antibiotics, needed a real veterinarian, not a washed-up Coast Guard officer playing doctor in a tide pool. But James was what the calf had. So James worked. He used an entire bottle of saline solution, cleaning the wound as thoroughly as he dared. The calf vocalized several times during the process, sounds of pain that made James's chest ache, but the young orca held still, remarkably, impossibly still. From behind him, James heard the mother moving through the water. He tensed, waiting for the strike that would end this. But when he glanced back, the adult orca had not moved closer. She was simply watching. Watching this human touch her calf, watching him try to help, and she was choosing not to kill him. James pulled out antibiotic ointment and began applying it to the wound. It was designed for humans in small quantities. He had no idea if it would work on an orca or if the amount he was using was enough or too much. He was working blind, operating on instinct and prayer. The biggest problem was keeping the wound clean in salt water. The moment James stopped actively rinsing and treating the injury, the ocean would rush in, carrying bacteria and debris. He needed some kind of covering, some kind of barrier. He pulled out the tarp from his backpack. It was maybe 6 by 8 feet, meant for covering supplies or creating shelter. James cut long strips of gauze from his kit and began positioning the tarp over the calf's wound. He used the gauze strips to tie the tarp in place, looping them around the orca's body behind the dorsal fin and under the belly. The calf allowed this, actually shifted its body slightly to make James's work easier. It took 20 minutes to secure the makeshift bandage. By the time James finished, his hands were shaking with cold and adrenaline. The tarp would not stay on long in the water, would not provide real protection, but it was better than nothing. James backed away from the calf slowly. He checked his watch. The tide had been going out for maybe 90 minutes now. That meant another hour, hour and a half, until it hit its lowest point. Then it would start coming back in, but slowly, so slowly. It would be at least 4 hours before there was enough water for these orcas to swim free. 4 hours with water getting dangerously shallow, with the sun rising higher in the sky, with these animals trapped and increasingly stressed. James waded back to the edge of the cove and pulled himself up onto the rocks. He needed to think. The calf's wound was stabilized as much as he could manage. But both orcas needed to stay calm, needed to stay in the deeper center of the pool. If they panicked, if they tried to beach themselves on the rocky edges, they would tear their skin apart. The stones here were covered in barnacles and mussels, sharp edges that would cut through orca skin like razors. And there was another problem James had not fully considered: temperature. Orcas were designed for the deep, cold ocean. Even though the water in this cove was cold by human standards, it was warmer than the open ocean, and getting warmer as the sun climbed higher. The shallow water was already heating up. In full sun, with only a few feet of water, the cove would warm significantly. Orcas could overheat, could literally cook in water that was too warm. James looked around the cove, thinking hard. The high rock walls provided some shade, but not enough. He needed to keep the water cool, needed to increase circulation. The incoming tide would help, but that was hours away. An idea formed. Insane like everything else about this situation, but it might work. There was a small freshwater stream that fed into the cove from the eastern side, just a trickle really flowing down from the forest above. But it was cold mountain runoff, barely above freezing. If James could redirect that stream channel, more of it into the pool, it would help cool the water, keep it circulating. He started climbing up the eastern wall of the cove, following the sound of running water. His muscles burned, and his wetsuit was chafing, but he kept moving. He found the stream about 30 feet up, trickling down through moss-covered rocks. James began moving stones, building a small dam, redirecting the flow into a more direct channel down to the cove. It was back-breaking work. The stones were heavy, slippery. His hands were bleeding from cuts he could not feel through the cold. But he kept working, because below him in that shrinking pool 2 orcas were depending on him. A calf that had trusted him enough to swim bleeding through dangerous waters to find him. A mother that had chosen not to kill him when he approached her wounded baby. He would not fail them. Could not fail them. By the time James finished redirecting the stream, maybe 40 minutes had passed. He slid back down to the cove and checked the orcas. The fresh water was flowing into the pool, now adding maybe 10 or 15 gallons per minute. Not much, but enough to create some circulation, some cooling. The calf and mother were still in the center of the pool where the water was deepest. The calf's makeshift bandage was still in place, though James could see blood seeping through. The wound was still bleeding, but slower. Maybe. Hard to tell. James checked the tide. It had reached its lowest point. The entrance to the cove was now barely 2 feet deep at the center, a jumble of exposed rocks and tide pools. There was no way the orcas could leave. They would have to wait. The next 3 hours were the longest of James's life. He stayed in the cove with the orcas, monitoring them constantly. He re-cleaned the calf's wound, twice reapplied antibiotic ointment, adjusted the tarp bandage. The calf allowed all of it, watching James with those intelligent eyes, making soft vocalizations that the mother answered with her own calls. James talked to them. It was stupid and he knew it, but the sound of a human voice seemed to help keep them calm. He told them about his life, about his years in the Coast Guard. He told them about Ethan, about the son he had lost, about the guilt he carried, about how he had come to this empty stretch of coast to be alone with his failure. He was 15, James said, his voice rough with emotion he had not allowed himself to feel in 4 years. Smart as hell, wanted to be a marine biologist, loved the ocean the way some kids love video games or sports. We took the sailboat out that morning, even though the forecast was borderline. I thought we had time before the weather turned. I was wrong. The mother orca surfaced near where James stood. She made a sound deep and resonant. James had no idea what it meant, but it felt like acknowledgement, like understanding. The storm came up faster than predicted, James continued. I tried to get us back to harbor, but the mast snapped. We went into the water. I got Ethan into a life jacket, got him tied to debris, but the waves were so big. Coast Guard got the distress call. Helicopter was en route. But I was with another crew that day, responding to a tanker emergency. By the time I got back to where Ethan was supposed to be, James stopped. Even now, even 4 years later, he could not say the rest out loud, could not describe finding his son's body, could not describe the moment he realized he had failed at the only thing that really mattered. The calf surfaced then and made that same whistling cry that James had first heard, but this time it sounded different, less desperate, almost like comfort. "You brought me here," James said, looking at the young orca. "You trusted me when you had no reason to. Your mother trusted me. I won't fail you. I swear to God I won't fail you." The sun climbed higher. James used his tarp to create shade over part of the pool, rigging it with rope between rocks. It helped a little. The water temperature stabilized, maybe even cooled slightly, with the freshwater stream adding its flow. And slowly, achingly slowly, the tide began to turn. At first, James thought he was imagining it, but then he saw it clearly. The waterline on the rocks beginning to rise, inch by inch the ocean coming back, the entrance to the cove starting to fill. James watched the water rise with desperate intensity. The orcas sensed it too. Both animals became more active, swimming in slow circles, vocalizing to each other. They knew freedom was coming. It took another 90 minutes for the entrance to fill enough. James stood at the edge of the cove watching as the rocky barrier slowly disappeared beneath rising water. When the depth at the entrance reached maybe 5 feet, he waded out into the channel. The mother orca approached the entrance. She was moving slowly, carefully testing the depth. Still not quite enough. She would scrape her belly on those rocks if she tried now. James waited, watched. The water kept rising. At 6 feet deep, the mother made her decision. She began swimming toward the entrance, building up as much speed as the small cove allowed. James's heart was in his throat. If she misjudged, if the rocks were too close to the surface, she would tear herself open. The massive orca reached the entrance and dove. Her dorsal fin disappeared beneath the surface. James held his breath. 5 seconds. 10. 15. Then suddenly she was through. Her dorsal fin cut through the water on the outside of the cove. She had made it. She surfaced and breached her entire body, launching out of the water in what might have been joy or relief or just the pure pleasure of being free. The sound of her crashing back into the ocean echoed off the rock walls. The calf started toward the entrance, but James moved to block its path. "Not yet," he said urgently. "Your bandage." He waded to the calf and quickly removed the tarp and gauze strips. The wound looked better. Maybe. The bleeding had stopped at least. James applied one more coat of antibiotic ointment, knowing it would wash away immediately but needing to do something. "Okay," he said, stepping back. "Go to your mother." The calf moved toward the entrance. It was moving better than before, James thought. More coordinated. The young orca paused at the mouth of the cove and looked back at James. For a long moment their eyes met. Then the calf dove and was through. James climbed up onto the rocks, exhausted beyond measure. He watched as mother and calf reunited in the open water. They circled each other, touching constantly, vocalizing in patterns James could not interpret. The mother was examining her calf, checking the wound. James had no idea if his treatment would be enough, if the calf would survive the injury, but at least it had a chance now. The two orcas began swimming north, back toward deeper water. James watched them go, feeling something shift in his chest. Some weight he had carried for 4 years beginning finally to lift. He started to turn away to begin the long hike back to his cabin. But then the calf stopped. The young orca turned and began swimming back toward the cove. The mother followed, calling, but the calf kept coming. They stopped maybe 30 yards offshore. Close enough that James could see their eye patches clearly. The calf surfaced and made a sound. Not the desperate cry from before, something different. Almost like gratitude. James raised his hand. "You're welcome," he said, his voice breaking. "Stay safe out there." The mother surfaced next to her calf. She made that deep, resonant call again. Then she did something that made tears stream down James's face. She made a sound he had only heard about, never experienced. A sound orcas make only with pod members, with family, with those they trust. She chuffed. The sound carried across the water, clear and unmistakable. James had read about it in his Coast Guard training. The sound orcas use to communicate affection, recognition, bond. James made the sound back. His human vocal cords produced a poor imitation, rough and inadequate but carrying the right intention. "I see you too," he whispered. "Thank you for trusting me." Mother and calf dove then, and were gone. The water returned to its restless movement, showing no sign that two orcas had been there moments before. James sat on the rocks until the sun began to set, painting the clouds orange and gold. His body ached, his hands were torn and bleeding. He was exhausted in a way that went beyond physical weariness, but something had changed. Something fundamental had shifted inside him. For 4 years, he had punished himself for failing Ethan, had isolated himself, convinced that he did not deserve connection, did not deserve to try to help anyone again. He had believed that his failure defined him, that it was the only truth that mattered. But today a wounded animal had chosen to trust him, had sought him out specifically and brought him into a situation where lives depended on his choices, and he had not failed. He had done everything he could with what he had, and it had been enough. Maybe it would always be enough if he just tried, if he stopped running from the possibility of failure and started accepting that trying mattered more than succeeding. James stood slowly and began the hike back to his cabin. His marine radio sat heavy on his belt, still set to channel 16. Tomorrow he would turn it on, would check in with the Coast Guard, would let them know he was available if they needed him, would stop hiding from the world and from the possibility that he might still have something to offer. Tonight he would rest, would let himself feel the exhaustion and the pain, and underneath it all, the first stirrings of something that might eventually become peace. He did not see the orcas again for 5 months. Winter passed, and spring came bringing calmer seas and longer days. James returned to part-time work with the Coast Guard, helping with rescues and emergency response. His commander had welcomed him back, without questions, without judgment. Sarah called him in March. They talked for 3 hours. It was not reconciliation exactly, but it was a beginning, a recognition that they had both been drowning in grief, and maybe it was time to start swimming again. In late April, James was on patrol with a young Coast Guardsman named Marcus, running safety checks on recreational boats near the Cape. It was a beautiful afternoon, warm and clear with light winds, perfect conditions. They were checking a fishing boat when Marcus pointed out to sea. "Sir," he said, urgency in his voice. "Look." James turned and felt his heart stop. A pod of orcas was approaching, maybe 7 or 8 animals, including 2 very small calves. But in the lead were 2 orcas, 1 massive adult female and 1 younger animal, maybe 2 years old now, still juvenile but growing into its size. The young orca had a distinctive scar on its right flank, a long white